At the end of this video, you should be able to identify and describe the 3 types of plate boundaries, and list and describe 3 causes of plate movement. Chapter 10, Section 2, Earthquakes. Scientists identify plate boundaries primarily by studying data from earthquakes. When tectonic plates move, sudden shifts can occur along their boundaries. These sudden shifts are called earthquakes. Frequent earthquakes in a given zone are evidence that 2 or more plates may meet in that area. Volcanoes. The locations of volcanoes can also help identify the locations of plate boundaries. Some volcanoes form when plate motions generate magma that erupts from Earth's surface. For example, the Pacific Ring of Fire is a zone of active volcanoes that encircles the Pacific Ocean. This zone is also one of Earth's major earthquake zones. The characteristics of this zone indicate that the Pacific Ocean is surrounded by plate boundaries. Types of plate boundaries. Some of the most dramatic changes in Earth's crust, such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, happen along plate boundaries. Plate boundaries may be in the middle of the ocean floor, around the edges of continents, or even within continents. There are 3 types of plate boundaries. These plate boundaries are divergent boundaries, convergent boundaries, and transform boundaries. Each plate boundary is associated with a characteristic type of geologic activity. Divergent boundaries. The way that plates move relative to each other determines how the plate boundary affects Earth's surface. At a divergent boundary, 2 plates move away from each other. A divergent boundary is illustrated on the screen here. At divergent boundaries, magma from the asthenosphere rises to the surface as the plates move apart. The magma then cools to form new oceanic lithosphere. The newly formed rock at the ridge is warm and light. This warm, light rock sits higher than the surrounding seafloor because it's less dense. This rock forms undersea mountain ranges known as mid-ocean ridges. Along the center of a mid-ocean ridge is a rift valley, a narrow valley that forms where the plates separate. Most divergent boundaries are located on the ocean floor. However, rift valleys may also form where continents have separated by plate movement. For example, the Red Sea occupies a huge rift valley formed by the separation of the African plate and the Arabian plate. Convergent boundaries. As plates pull apart at one boundary, they push into neighboring plates at other boundaries. Convergent boundaries are boundaries that form where 2 plates collide. 3 types of collisions can happen at convergent boundaries. One type happens when oceanic lithosphere collides with continental lithosphere, as is shown on the screen here. Because oceanic lithosphere is denser, it subducts or sinks under the less dense continental lithosphere. The region along a plate boundary where one plate moves under another plate is called a subduction zone. Deep ocean trenches form at subduction zones. As the oceanic plate subducts, it heats up and releases fluids into the mantle above it. The addition of these fluids causes material in the overlying mantle to melt to form magma. The magma rises to the surface and forms volcanic mountains. A second type of collision happens when 2 plates made of continental lithosphere collide. In this type of collision, neither plate subducts because neither plate is dense enough to subduct under the other plate. Instead, the colliding edges crumple and thicken, which causes uplift that forms large mountain ranges. The Himalaya mountains formed in this type of collision. The third type of collision happens when 2 plates that are made of oceanic lithosphere collide. One plate subducts under the other plate, and a deep ocean trench forms. Fluids released from the subducted plate cause mantle rock to melt and form magma. The magma rises to the surface to form an island arc, which is a chain of volcanic islands. Japan is an example of an island arc. Transform boundaries. The boundary at which two plates slide past each other horizontally, as is shown on the screen here, is called a transform boundary. However, the plate edges usually do not slide along smoothly. Instead, they scrape against each other in a series of sudden spurts of motion that are felt as earthquakes. Unlike other types of boundaries, transform boundaries do not produce magma. The San Andreas Fault in California is a major transform boundary between the North American plate and the Pacific plate. Transform motion also occurs along mid-ocean ridges. Short segments of a mid-ocean ridge are connected by transform boundaries called fracture zones. Causes of plate motion. Scientists don't fully understand what force drives plate tectonics. Many scientists think that the movement of tectonic plates is partly due to convection. Convection is the movement of heated material due to differences in density that are caused by differences in temperature. This process can be modeled by boiling water in a pot on a stove. As the water at the bottom of the pot is heated, the water at the bottom expands and becomes less dense than the cooler water above it. The cooler, denser water sinks. The warmer water rises to the surface to create a cycle called a convection cell. Mantle convection. Scientists think that Earth is also a convecting system. Energy generated by Earth's core and radioactivity within the mantle heat mantle material. This heated material rises through the cooler, denser material around it. As the hot material rises, the cooler, denser material flows away from the hot material and sinks into the mantle to replace the rising material. As the mantle material moves, it drags the overlying tectonic plates along with it, as is shown on the screen here. Convection currents and the resulting drag on the bottoms of tectonic plates can explain many aspects of plate movement, but scientists have identified two specific mechanisms of convection that help drive the process of plate movement. Ridge push. Newly formed rock at a mid-ocean ridge is warm and less dense than other rock nearby. The warm, less dense rock is elevated above nearby rock, and older, denser rock slopes downward away from the ridge. As the newer, warmer rock cools and becomes denser, it begins to sink into the mantle and pull away from the ridge. As the cooling rock sinks, the asthenosphere below it exerts force on the rest of the plate. This force is called ridge push. This force pushes the rest of the plate away from the mid-ocean ridge. Ridge push is illustrated on the screen here. Scientists think that ridge push may help drive plate motions. However, most scientists agree that ridge push is not the main driving force of plate motion. Slab pull. Where plates pull away from each other at mid-ocean ridges, magma from the asthenosphere rises to the surface. The magma then cools to form new lithosphere. As the lithosphere moves away from the mid-ocean ridge, the lithosphere cools and becomes denser. Where the lithosphere is dense enough, it begins to subduct into the asthenosphere. As the leading edge of the plate sinks, it pulls the rest of the plate along behind it. The force exerted by the sinking plate is called slab pull. This process is shown on the screen. In general, plates that are subducting move faster than plates that are not subducting. This evidence indicates that the downward pull of the subducting lithosphere is a strong driving force for tectonic plate motion. All three mechanisms of Earth's convecting system, drag on the bottom of tectonic plates, ridge push, and slab pull, work together to drive plate motions. These mechanisms form a system that makes Earth's tectonic plates move constantly.
The Earth's crust is broken up into jigsaw-like pieces called tectonic plates. This map shows the major tectonic plates and their relative direction of movement. Notice that many tectonic plates include both continental and oceanic crust. Tectonic plates are pieces of the lithosphere that move around on top of the asthenosphere. Compare the thickness of the South American plate below the Andes mountain range to the plate below the oceanic crust. Mountain ranges that occur in continental crust have very deep roots relative to their height.
At this point, you should be able to identify and describe the 3 types of plate boundaries and list and describe 3 causes of plate movement.